Hello and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins. Today I'm talking about The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, published in 1985, and I'm comparing it with the movie from 1990 directed by Volker Schlondorf. And I will also be talking about season 1 of the TV show, which aired in 2017, and the TV show creator is Bruce Miller. So season 1 of the show is an adaptation of the book. After that, they're just doing their own thing. There is a sequel, The Testaments, that Margaret Atwood published in 2019, so she published that 2 years after the show had already begun. But anyway, for the TV show, seasons 2 on, they are just doing their own thing, so I will only be talking about season 1. And I highlighted so much of this book while I was reading it. It was fantastic. I would highly recommend it if you have not read it already. And honestly, just with the book alone, I have so much I want to say, and there's just so much to get into. So the fact that I'm also talking about 2 different adaptations, there is just a lot to say in this video. So I am just going to get right to it. Get right into the plot details, which means we will have spoilers going forward. So the story takes place in a dystopian future where fertile women are forced to become handmaids, and a handmaid is a woman who is assigned to the house of a powerful political leader and his wife, and she is forced to be raped by the man in hopes that she will become pregnant because birth rates have dropped drastically. And so the goal is to get the handmaids pregnant. They will give birth. Once they give birth, they give the baby to this couple that they have been living with, and then from there they are assigned to another house where they do the same thing all over again. And if a handmaid, if she is living in a certain house and she doesn't get pregnant within a number of months, then she is transferred to a new house. And if she is in multiple houses and never gets pregnant, then after a certain amount of time, she is sent to the colonies. And the colonies is like this place where people are cleaning up like nuclear waste or something. We never go to the colonies in the book, but yeah, it's a place where you go and it's like a guarantee you're gonna die because it's so toxic and horrible. And the handmaids also do not use their given names anymore, and they have been assigned new names based on the name of the man whose house they are living in. So for example, our main character, she is referred to as Offred because the house she is living in, the man, he is just referred to as the commander, but his first name is Fred. So she is of Fred, Offred. And so once she gets transferred to another house, her name would change. So we have handmaids who are named Offwarren, Offglen, Offdaniel, and that is the name of the man they are living with. And in the book, we never learn this character's true name. However, in the movie, they call her Kate. In the TV show, they call her June. And readers have long speculated that June is her name in the book because they feel like different clues were given to the reader. However, Atwood has said that that wasn't her intention, but she is fine with people making that assumption if they want to. So I am going to call her June throughout the rest of this video rather than Offred. But in all versions, we see into her life from the time before, and we also get a glimpse into how this patriarchal Christian nationalist rule came to be. But we see the most backstory in the TV show. And some details they do get from the book, whereas others they just created themselves. And I get it's a TV show and they need more content to fill the time. And yet I did feel like certain details were just unnecessary, and it did feel like they were just trying to fill time because I personally thought the book, what we got in the book, was sufficient. However, I did read reviews where book readers did wish they had learned more, like how did these people come in power? And so for people who wanted more information, I'm sure they would love the show because we get more information. But yeah, for me personally, I thought the book was sufficient. And so certain details in the show, I mean, it's a 10-hour show. And so I feel like sometimes it felt like it was being dragged out more than necessary. But I will also say that I am a hard sell when it comes to adapting a book that isn't that long into a TV show. I like 9 times out of 10, I just prefer it to be made into a movie. But I understand they wanted to continue this story beyond just what we read in the book. And so that's one of the reasons they did it as a TV show. But yeah, anyway, basically I'm just saying I felt like sometimes the show added a bit too much padding and more backstory than I felt necessary. Like the scene when they're talking about why they call it the ceremony, it's like, I feel like it's pretty obvious why they call it a ceremony. We didn't need to hear them talk it out and figure out, why they're going to call it that. But anyway, I'm kind of going on a tangent there. But yeah, so June's past. We see that she had been married and she and her husband had a little girl. And as things were getting bad, they did try to escape the country. However, they end up being caught and they were separated. And then June is sent to the Red Center where women are sent to be trained to become handmaids. But when the story takes place, the house that she is in, the commander seems to be sterile, which we hear is very common for these men. However, men take no blame. So if a handmaid isn't getting pregnant, it's considered to be her fault. But yeah, so chances are he is sterile. And his wife, Serena Joy, she knows this. And so she tells June, like, why don't you just have sex with our house driver, whose name is Nick? That way you can actually become pregnant and we don't need to tell anybody how this happened. And she is like, yeah, like people do this all the time. And like it benefits the house for the handmaid to become pregnant, right? So Serena Joy is doing this for her own benefit. But yeah, so June meets up with Nick and the two of them have sex. In the TV show, Serena Joy is there in the room while it happens, and that is the only version where she is present for it. But anyway, after this first interaction, June then returns voluntarily time and time again, and she and Nick begin a romance. And I did love getting these scenes with her and Nick and just the contrast between those sex scenes with the scenes during the ceremony, because I didn't even mention it, but when the commander rapes the handmaid, the wife is there and it's part of this religious ceremony where it happens. And so getting those scenes and then seeing the scenes between her and Nick, just obviously they are entirely different types of scenes. But anyway, eventually June does become pregnant with Nick's baby. And in the book and in the movie, Serena Joy and the commander do not know that June is pregnant. She only tells Nick. And Nick then arranges for her escape and has a black van come get her. And black vans are owned by the government, and usually they show up when someone is being taken away for punishment. And in the book, they do claim that like she has broken some rule and that's why she is being taken away. Whereas in the movie, she murdered the commander. So that is the quote unquote reason why she is being taken away. But in both book and movie, the black van is not a government issued van, and instead, again, they are this like underground rebellion resistance group that is taking June to safety. And the movie ends with us seeing June very pregnant, living in an RV, outside of the country as she awaits Nick and awaits the end of this regime. And I did like this movie ending because it's positive because we see she has escaped, but it's not like an overly sappy, cheesy, happy ending because there's still a lot left unknown, right? And her living in the wilderness in an RV isn't ideal, but just seeing her escape. And yeah, I thought they did a good job having a positive ending without making it overly sappy or something. Whereas with the book, so she gets into the black van and then that's the end of the chapter. And I thought when I first read this, I thought that was the end of the book because after that page, the next page says historical notes on a Handmaid's Tale. And I assumed that was like some sort of afterword that wasn't part of the book. And it was, just some added thing in this edition that I was reading. So I thought the book literally ended with her getting in the van and not knowing what was going to happen. And I was just like, what kind of an ending is that? That's horrible. But turns out the section called Historical Notes on a Handmaid's Tale, that is still the book. We are still within this world because this section ends up being a transcription from a seminar that is being held like 100 years in the future. And it is these people who are having a seminar studying this time period with the handmaids. It's called Gilead. And so they are studying the Gilead regime. And they have also found June's journal. And so they are studying that as well. And we find out that her journal was found along the Underground Female Road, which is the name of the underground organization that would smuggle women out of Gilead. And so because that's where they found her journal, and her journal ends as she's getting into the van, we know that the van was taking her to safety and that she made it along this underground female road. Whether or not she got out officially, it's very ambiguous. But this section also tells us that this government did eventually come to an end. So of course I liked that too. And we don't know how long it lasted, but just knowing that it was eventually taken down was just all I needed to know. And so I personally find this to be a positive ending, despite it also being very ambiguous. But I also like how Atwood just leaves it up to the reader to decide how positive an ending it is. And I am going to choose to believe that June did make it out, that she was reunited with her daughter at some point. And yeah, I am just going to choose to believe that it ended positively for June. And also, this is a book where our main character has no agency, right? Like, she cannot make any choices in her life, at least not many. And so the fact that Atwood gives us an ending where the reader gets to choose what we think has happened, I don't know if that was like her intention with making it ambiguous, but yeah, I kind of like that aspect too, where Atwood is giving us our agency and us allowing us to make this choice, And in general, I just thought this was a really cool way to end the book, to have it be the seminar taking place in the future. I really liked that. But to talk about season 1 ending. So in the end of season 1, we see Nick telling her to get into the van and telling her to trust him. And it ends with her being taken away in the van. And so I assumed she was being taken away to safety, since that is what the book implies and it's what happens in the movie. But to talk about where the van does take her, I am now going to get into the details of episode 1 of season 2. I will not talk beyond that, but I just want to share what happens to her in the van. And so I will get into spoilers for episode 1. So yeah, we see that the van actually was a government issued van, and she really is being taken to be punished for like a rebellion that happened earlier, which I will talk about. But I was so disappointed when I read this. I didn't actually watch the episode, I just read about it, but to learn that the van wasn't taking her to safety and that she spends more time in Gilead as a handmaid undergoing this abuse, I was kind of annoyed. And again, like, this show has gone on for like 5 seasons. And so it almost feels like, oh, we got to stretch out her time in Gilead and we got to have her go through all of, even more trauma in order to make this show last. Because if she escaped Gilead, the first episode of season 2, maybe they were worried they wouldn't have enough happening to continue the show beyond that. I'm not really sure, but I personally hate the fact that the van wasn't taking her to safety. And so, yeah, I have no interest in watching season 2, to be honest. If someone wants to comment and let me know, what season does June actually escape? Maybe that is the season that I will begin watching, because I just can't handle the darkness and sadness of her being a handmaid. But I would love to pick up the show when she escapes, because I am curious what happens with all of these characters. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this whole scene with the black van down below in the comments. But now I need to talk about Moira. So this is a woman who was gay that June was friends with even before the Red Center, which again, the Red Center is where women are sent to become handmaids. So in the book and in the show, she knew Moira from even before. They had been longtime friends. Whereas in the movie, they switch it and they have her meet Moira on her way to the Red Center. But Moira, she had a very rebellious attitude and she made multiple attempts to escape the center before eventually succeeding. And June doesn't know what has happened to her since. And in the show and movie, June helps Moira escape, because in the movie she helps get one of the aunts. By the way, so the women who instruct them in the Red Center, they're referred to as aunts. So the main one is called Aunt Lydia. So June helps her get one of these aunts into the bathroom and they tie her up. And in the movie, Moira then wears the aunt's clothes and leaves the center. Whereas in the TV show, June helps her tie up the aunt, but then she also leaves with Moira and both of them escape. However, they end up being separated and June gets caught and sent back to the center. But eventually the commander takes June to the club, which is a sex club that high-ranking men attend, and she sees Moira is one of the women forced to work there. And the commander tells June that the women here are those who were unable to assimilate to life outside, and he seems to take pleasure in rattling off the impressive careers that so many of these women once had in the time before. And now here they are, forced into this demeaning line of work. But she does eventually get the chance to talk to Moira one-on-one, and Moira tells her how during her escape, she ended up getting caught and she could choose either between working at the club and working in the colonies. And so she chose the club. And again, Moira, she was always fighting the system, but when June sees her at the club, that fire inside of Moira has left and she has kind of just resigned herself to this life. And June is just so heartbroken to see this change in Moira, like that the system broke her down essentially. And in the book and in the movie, this is the last we see of her. Whereas in the TV show, so when they talk and June sees that Moira, like how much she has changed, and she's just kind of like, hey, like I'm just going to keep my head down and do my job and I'm not going to try to fight back anymore. When June hears this, she tells her like, what? Like, don't let them grind you down. Like, this isn't who you are. Don't let them do this to you, essentially. And in the TV show, we then end up see Moira escape and she makes it all the way to Canada. And the scene in the refugee center when the guy in charge is just going over everything with her, just that scene right there just had me feeling so emotional and it was so fantastic. And she ends up being reunited with Luke, who is June's husband, who I will be talking about in a minute. But yeah, and so I loved that even though based on episode 1 of season 2, June does not escape Gilead, I love that we at least see Moira escape, right? Because at least someone makes it out of here by the end. But yeah, to talk about Luke. So again, he, June, and their daughter tried to escape. However, they were stopped. And in the book, she does not know what happened to Luke. However, in the movie, the 90s movie, Luke was shot and killed. So she knows he's dead. Whereas in the show, she doesn't know what happened. She assumes he's dead because she heard gunshots, but she doesn't know. However, we see in an episode everything that happened with Luke, and we see that he did escape and he made it to Canada. And again, he is reunited with Moira in the end. And also partway through the TV show, there is this ambassador of Mexico that comes to visit, and her assistant guy, he is part of like this underground resistance. And so he tells June like, hey, your husband is alive, and if you write him a note, I can get it to him. And so at this point in the story, both June and Luke know that the other is alive. But I want to share a quote from the book, and this, going back in time a bit, this is when things started to change in the world, because we see June, all women are let go of their jobs. So we see June be let go. And then also she tries to use her card and she has no money in her account because any money that any woman had has been transferred to their male next of kin. So all of her money was transferred into Luke's account. And so as this is happening, Luke tries to comfort June and he says, hush, you know I'll always take care of you. I thought he's already starting to patronize me. And I just wanted to share that line because I do think that's important too, because Luke is a good guy, right? He's not one of the bad ones. And yet this shows how they view this experience so differently due to the fact that Luke's own life hasn't changed aside from how he's impacted by the changes in June's life. But it shows how even good men could be out of touch and naive and be negatively influenced by these rules and just not realize the sexist way they are responding. Like he doesn't even realize he's being patronizing and condescending, right? And so just seeing how even good men, how they are impacted by this. And instead he takes on the role of like, oh, it's okay. Like I'll take care of you. And if I was June, I wouldn't want a man to say like, oh, don't worry, I'll take care of you. Like, I don't want you to take care of me. I want us to fight back to get out of this situation. And again, obviously, they do eventually try to leave, right? But in this moment, how even Luke just is kind of like, oh, I'll take care of you. And he takes on this leadership position in a sense, when it's like, that's not what June wants. That's not what she wants to hear. And yeah, anyway. But something else I wanted to share about the time before is that we see, this is not in the movie, only in the book and in the TV show, we see that Luke had been married when he and June began an affair, and then Luke leaves his wife to be with June. And I loved this detail about their past, in part because it isn't ideal, right? Like most people hate cheaters and hate the one who breaks up a relationship, but I think it made June feel more complex by not having her be this quote unquote perfect example of a person from the time before. And it just makes her feel more human and more real, which makes this whole story feel more real and all the more horrific. And I also like too that June isn't like a hero in this story, right? Like Moira is one of the ones who is always escaping and trying to do different things, or Ofglen, who is part of Mayday, this underground rebellion. Whereas June, she has her own ways of rebelling, of course, and yet for the most part, she is just like a very average person who is forced into this scenario. And I feel like that too, it makes the story more relatable, but it also makes it feel less sensationalized and less like she's not romanticizing this dystopian future, right? It's all very bleak. And part of that is because June isn't written to be a hero of the story, and she isn't written to have been like this perfect person who is now forced into this situation. Like, no, she was just a normal person. And so, yeah, I just appreciate that this book does not in any way try to romanticize the trauma that is going on. And it also doesn't feel like quote unquote trauma porn at all either. It just feels very real. And then I also need to talk about Janine and Ofglen, who are two other handmaids. And so to begin with Janine, so she is someone June meets at the Red Center. And in the show, she talks back early on and has her eye removed as punishment, but this was not in the book or the movie. But in all versions, she at one point becomes delusional while at the center before Moira snaps her out of it. And we also see in all versions, one of the things they do at the Red Center is they have a woman get in front of the others and they share a story of when they were sexually harassed in one way or another. And so we see when Janine is up there, she's telling a story about how when she was gang And during this story, they have all of the handmaids around her point and say, your fault, your fault, your fault. And so obviously they are teaching them to victim blame and shame and the thought that any sexual harassment a woman receives, it's implying that it was something she had coming due to her appearance or her lifestyle or just something she was doing. And so yeah, in this society, men are not held accountable for anything whatsoever, and it is always 100% the woman's fault. But once they become handmaids, Janine does end up getting pregnant, which at first is like, it's something she's so proud of, right? Because that's what everybody wants, is to be pregnant. But then she ends up giving birth and it's a healthy baby girl. But in all versions, we see just how this affects her, right? To give birth to a baby in this situation. And ultimately in the book, we later find out that the baby wasn't even any good. And apparently they got rid of it in some way. We don't know the exact details, like what was wrong with the baby. We don't know. But in this society, birth defects are very common. And so yeah, apparently the baby wasn't even any good. And Janine is then sent to another household and she just becomes mentally unwell, which is very understandable. Whereas in the movie, the baby is healthy as far as we know and nothing is wrong with it. But we do see by the end that Janine has just kind of lost it. Whereas in the TV show, so Janine gives birth to a healthy baby girl, but she tells June, my commander, he loves me and he is going to take me and our baby away and we're going to be a family together. But of course, this guy was lying. And so she is sent to another household to be their handmaid, but she ends up escaping that house. She goes and she takes her baby from the previous house she was part of. And then we see her standing on a bridge that threatening to kill herself and her baby. And June was known to be friends with Janine. And so they have June come to try to talk Janine down. And this scene was just so incredible and so emotional. And I thought it was so well done, like seeing the two of them talking as June is trying to get her down. And ultimately, Janine does pass her baby off to June, but then she herself jumps off the bridge. However, her agency to take her own life isn't even granted her because they end up saving her, but they save her not because they want to save her life. They instead save her. That way they can execute her in their more official punishment fashion, which is just, again, it's not about trying to save her life. It's all about pride. But yeah, and so they take her to be executed, and how they want her to die is they get all of the handmaids around her and they want them to stone Janine and kill her. However, all of the handmaids rebel and they don't do this. And so this is why in the end, the van comes to get June, is because all of the handmaids are being punished for not having killed Janine. And by the way, the government, the reason why they wanted Janine dead was because to threaten to harm a baby is, a huge offense. And so they're like, she threatened to kill that baby. And so now we are putting her to death. And just a side tangent kind of, Aunt Lydia in the TV show I found to be very interesting, and I am very curious what happens with her in later seasons, because we see how she's enforcing these rules, which are horrible, and yet we see that she definitely cares about Janine, right? We get multiple scenes with that, and yet here she is telling them to kill her, right? And so you can tell that she has complicated emotions going on, and so again, I am curious what happens with that character in the later seasons. I'm not personally concerned about spoilers, so if you just want to comment down below and let me know what happens to her. But yeah, I thought she was a really interesting character here. And then to talk about Ofglen. So all of the handmaids, they have other duties within the household, like they do the shopping, but they are not allowed to go anywhere on their own. They always have a partner. And so Ofglen is June's shopping partner. And June initially thinks that Ofglen is just so pious and she can't stand her. However, turns out Ofglen is actually part of the underground resistance called Mayday, and she eventually tells June about this. However, one day June goes to go shopping with Ofglen when it is no longer the Ofglen she knows. And in the book, the new Ofglen tells her that the old Ofglen, that the black van had come to take her away, but that Ofglen had committed suicide before they could take her. Whereas in the show, Ofglen is taken away, and it is because in the show we learn that she was gay, and so she's taken away and they disfigure her body to prevent her from, wanting things she shouldn't. And then after this surgery, she is put back to being a handmaid. But then one day we see her see an opportunity to hijack a car that belongs to the government. And so she drives in the car before then running over one of the officials. And so she kills him. And then she obviously is taken away and arrested, and we don't see her for the rest of the show. And in the movie, the 90s movie, Ofglen, she is part of the underground resistance, and she knows that June is meeting secretly with the commander, because the commander, they're not supposed to spend time one-on-one, but the commander will summon her to his office. And so Ofglen tells her like, hey, we know you're meeting with the commander and we want you to kill him. And they smuggle a knife into June's room. And that is how she is able to kill the commander in the end. And no other version has her killing the commander. It is just the movie. But even though this isn't true to the book, I did like this detail in the movie, and it was satisfying to see the commander be killed. And yeah, he of course is just a horrible person in all versions. And again, he has her come to his study and they spend time together one-on-one, which is against the rules. And they play Scrabble together, which is also against the rules because women aren't allowed to read. And he also shows her his secret contraband of forbidden magazines. And then also, like I said, he also sneaks her into the sex club, which is also against the rules. And him trying to get close to her in this way, it does end up being present in the ceremony. And again, Serena Joy is his wife, and she is there during the ceremony. And so she can see that something is happening, something has changed. And in general, he just gets too overconfident with being obvious about the fact that they have something more going on, but he doesn't really have anything to lose by this, right? Like June is the one who will be punished if they are caught, not him. But there's a part in the book we read, perhaps he's reached the state of intoxication which power is said to inspire, the state in which you believe you are indispensable and can therefore do anything, absolutely anything you feel like, anything at all. And I thought that was a fantastic quote and feels pretty applicable to today's time. But I also want to talk about June's mom, who is not in the movie or the show. She is only in the book, but we hear how she was a women's activist, and she also gave birth to June like later in life. She was in her 30s, and June wasn't raised with a father. It was just the mother. And I just thought their relationship dynamic was very interesting to read about. It was not ideal by any means. But because she was such an activist, as things in the world were starting to change, June, she hasn't heard from her mom in a long time. And so they convince the landlord at the mom's apartment to let them in her room. And they see that it has been ransacked and she has been taken away. And we later find out that Moira, she says that after she got caught for trying to escape, they played her a video of the colonies. And in that video, she saw June's mom there in the colonies. And now I want to get into some of the details of this world that we are reading about in the book. Obviously, a lot of this book was incredibly hard to read, and reading about the training they had at the Red Center was just so terrible. Like the victim blaming and shaming, and the way they use fear and terror to force these women to act in a certain way and to force them to shame each other. And yeah, just the indoctrination and the brainwashing going on was just terrible. And also, I liked how in the book she makes a point to tell us how when the handmaids are being addressed, they refer to them as girls, and everybody's just so condescending towards them as if they are not grown women. June is 33 in the book, by the way, and yet all handmaids are talked down to and they are referred to as girls, and they only address a group of women as women if like wives are in the mix. And in my videos, I do try to avoid calling women girls because that is a condescending way to talk about grown adults, and yet it's such a common thing in our society. Like I still catch myself doing it, but I'm like, oh, like she's not a girl, like she's a woman, right? But yeah, so I thought that was a good detail that was added here. And then to continue with the theme of how men are being excused for every kind of behavior, essentially in Gilead, and women are always the ones that are going to be held accountable. This is another quote we got from the Red Center. Men can't help it, she said, meaning one of the aunts. God made them that way, but he did not make you that way. He made you different. It's up to you to set the boundaries. Later, you will be thanked. And so again, they're just constantly making excuses for men and allowing them to do whatever they want. And it's like, oh, well, it makes sense for him. But for the women, they are held to a very different standard. And they're kind of putting the female gender on a pedestal in a sense, where it's like, oh, like you're different than men. And so therefore you need to be held accountable because you're so much more responsible in a sense, while men can get away with doing whatever. And so they're putting them on a pedestal, but it's not in a good way. Putting someone on a pedestal is never good, right? But yeah, the way they do it, they only are doing that as a way to have an excuse to punish them. And then another quote from the Red Center I wanted to share reads, "Modesty is invisible," said Aunt Lydia. "Never forget it. To be seen is to be," her voice trembled, penetrated. What you must be, girls, is impenetrable. And we also hear them talk about the time before and how dangerous it was for women in the time before, right? Which is very true, right? Because she's talking about, meaning June is talking about how like, oh, like I would never run at night. And when I did run during the day, I would run on like frequented roads where I would never be alone, and, you know, never trusting a man who claims he is injured because he might be trying to trick you, and just all of the dangers that women constantly had to face in the previous world, they don't exist now. And so Gilead is claiming like, oh, we're making the world safe for women again, and we are protecting them. And it's interesting because, like, sure, in the sense of the fear of being attacked when you're out on a walk, like that fear doesn't exist anymore in Gilead. And yet this world is even more dangerous than ever because it is so insidious and evil, because the violence and the rape and the oppression is done under the guise of protection and religious laws. And so now the men who do those things to women, they can get away with it. So really, they're claiming that the women are protected in this world, but really it's the men who are being protected. And a political leader claiming that he is going to protect women whether they want it or not, that sounds really familiar. Like I'm pretty sure there was someone in real life who recently said that. I did want to say, though, that men who aren't in leadership roles in this patriarchal Christian nationalist society, they aren't living an ideal life either, and they have different rules and restrictions placed on them, and many of their own freedoms are also taken away in one sense or another. And in general, patriarchal setups are always bad for the boys and men raised in this society as well. And I will link to 2 other YouTube videos down below that I have watched in recent times that are fantastic, that talk about the dangers of patriarchy, because the male leaders are really the only ones benefiting, and the general male population is also hurt by not having a society where women are equals and also are in leadership roles. So patriarchy only benefits those at the top. Everybody else is suffering. Obviously, the women are more oppressed, but yeah, it doesn't help the men either. And also in the TV show, I did want to say the guy with Janine who had lied to her saying that, you know, they were going to be together, he gets in trouble because he was seeing Janine outside of the ceremony and doing different stuff with her, forcing her to do different stuff and lying to her. And we do see him get punished. He has his hand removed for doing this. And so I thought that was interesting that the show has them punishing one of their own. Granted, if he was a woman, his punishment would have been even more severe, I'm sure. But yeah, anyway, I thought that was an interesting part. And the commander, June's commander, he's not taking the trial very seriously, but the other men there are like, hey, come on, like this is a serious offense. You know, take this serious. Whereas the commander just kind of wants to dismiss it because he doesn't actually really care about enforcing these rules amongst themselves. But we also hear the aunts teach them how this transitional generation will have it the hardest, but in the future it'll be so much better. And we read, for generations that come after, Aunt Lydia said, it will be so much better. The women will live in harmony together, all in one family. You will be like daughters to them. And when the population level is up to scratch again, we'll no longer have to transfer you from one house to another because there will be enough to go around. There can be bonds of real affection under such conditions. Women united for a common end. And this makes me think of like when you read about polygamous cults, how like the ideal is that the first wives and the wives who come after, they should all be on board and see this as a blessing and it's a good thing and you're working together and this is what God wants. And so if you don't feel that way, there's something wrong with you, right? If you were a woman who is not okay with this setup, then it's like, well, you're not in tune with God and you're not willing to do God's bidding because this is what God wants from you, right? But it's also ironic that they are saying like, again, like, oh, this is for the benefit of women and eventually you guys will just be so close and it'll just be this ideal situation where you all get along so well. And it's ironic that they are claiming this is what they want when really they are fostering an environment where women hate each other because the wives and the handmaids dislike each other. The handmaids themselves dislike each other. The aunts and the handmaids dislike each other. And then there's jealousy and dislike amongst the wives as well. And then you also have the Marthas, who I won't even be talking about, but the Martha in the book, she does not like June and she treats her very badly, and she looks down on the fact that June is a handmaid as if June had any choice in the matter. And so yeah, they are fostering an environment where women are in competition with each other and they don't get along and they don't trust each other and they don't like each other. And so that is why the moments in the book and in the show and in the movie, but I feel like especially almost in the show and in the book, Anyway, the moments where we do see women coming together and bonding and working together, they were just so powerful and such important scenes, because that is what the men don't want, right? Like, these patriarchal societies do not want women banding together. They want women to be at odds with each other, right? That way, if you're busy thinking like this other woman is my competition and she is the one causing problems, then you're distracted and the men can go ahead and do whatever they want, when really the men are the common enemy. But yeah, so anyway, just this society making women dislike each other was a big part of the story. And then women are also not allowed to read, including the Bible, even though, again, this is a Christian nationalist society and the Bible is referenced and quoted all over the place, and yet only men are allowed to read it. And this kind of reminded me of Carrie, how Carrie's mom will have different ideas and quotes that she claims is coming from the Bible, even though it doesn't at all. And she's just making stuff up. And, you know, in the 2013 Carrie says to her, like, that's not even in the Bible, because Carrie reads the Bible and she knows. And so this world, they are making a society where women can't read the Bible. And therefore, that allows the men to cherry pick what they want from the Bible and give it whatever meaning they decide. And women can't argue it because they aren't even allowed to read, right? And in this society, the women here, they are old enough that they do remember reading, right? So June, there's certain times where she's like they're choosing to use this line and not the line that comes after. So she sees what's going on. But eventually, the girls who grow up to be the women in this society, they will never have read. And so they will not know what is true and what isn't. And they will just blindly believe what the men say because they don't know any better. And there is a line from the book that is just so fantastic and yet so incredibly heartbreaking. And it is when June is thinking back on her life before, when she and Luke were having a problem. But we read, "We thought we had such problems. How are we to know we were happy?" And again, so heartbreaking. And anyway, I just wanted to share that. But also I wanted to talk about how this society began, because like I said, we do get bits of this in the book. One aspect is how certain changes they started to make were things people could get behind, including June. And there is a part we read. The marts were shut though, and there were no longer any Feels on Wheels vans and bundle buggies circling the square. But I wasn't sad to see them go. We all knew what a nuisance they'd been. It's high time somebody did something, said the woman behind the counter. And so this book just shows how in real life, we need to be wary of leaders who say they want to clean up society, because it isn't going to stop at getting rid of porn and other sex work related things, because even if you're on board with that, like, that's not where it's going to stop, because ultimately these leaders, they're not interested in cleaning up society. They're just interested in controlling society. And I mean, we have all of these high-ranking leaders attending this sex club, right, in The Handmaid's Tale. So obviously that wasn't what they had a problem with, right? And yet on the outside, claiming they are against these things, as well as wanting to protect babies, right? That's a huge part. Claiming they want to protect babies and, you know, clean up the world. That is how they get people on their side. And that is how they get elected in the first place, right? Is claiming, you know, these traditional values and protecting women and babies and whatever. And yet, like, these people, they don't care. They don't care about saving babies at all. And they don't care about, you know, respecting motherhood. Again, it is just always about control. And so don't let yourself be fooled into thinking someone is actually wanting to save the babies when really they do not care at all. They just want more rules and more restrictions and more control. And then also I wanted to talk about how in this society, all women have assigned clothing, and all women, all groups have assigned colors they wear. So the handmaids wear red, the wives wear blue, and then like the Marthas, the aunts, they all have a uniform that they have to wear. And in the book specifically, the commander tells June, like, oh, the only reason women wore different outfits in the time before was like to keep men interested. And that's what it was always about, and finding new ways to tempt men. And so the fact that it's not about like maybe women wear different clothing because they want to and it's for themselves and fashion can be fun, right? Like, no, of course he doesn't think that. It all has to do with sex and temptation and making themselves, you know, alluring to men. And that's what it's always all about. And that is why now they have these uniforms, which are very unflattering. And even the wives, right? Even they are forced to wear a certain color and forced to wear very modest clothing. And I did want to talk about Serena Joy, who is the wife of the commander here. And I found her character also, like, she just had some interesting layers going on, because we hear how in all versions in the past life, she was a very fiery supporter of quote unquote traditional values, wanting women to prioritize having kids and being a homemaker and following Christian values. But clearly in all versions, we see that what life has ended up becoming, this isn't the life she fought for, and it's just not quite what she had in mind when she was preaching these things. And also, she is not allowed to read either, right? Like, no woman is above the law. And so all of them are subservient to the men. And she also resents June, and just all of the wives just dislike the handmaids, and they often take their anger out on the handmaids. And there is a part in the book when we read, Serena has begun to cry. I can hear her behind my back. It isn't the first time. She always does this the night of the ceremony. She's trying not to make a noise. She's trying to preserve her dignity in front of us. The upholstery and rugs muffle her, but we can hear her clearly despite that. And I find people like this so pitiable, though, because she was dumb enough to be preaching quote unquote traditional values, not realizing that it didn't matter that she was on the side of these men, because ultimately she is still a woman, and therefore she is not immune to the misogyny that was going to be implemented. And so women who are preaching these things, they are just being used and manipulated, and they don't even realize it until it is too late. And women and minorities who support leadership that is racist and sexist, even though they themselves are a woman or part of a minority, they feel like if extreme things happen, they will be spared since they were on the same side as these people. But again, that's just so naive and foolish, because at the end of the day, you too will be hurt by these leaders that you are currently getting behind. And sure, the wives maybe don't have it as bad as the handmaids, admittedly, and yet they are still living a miserable life that they hate, and they're just so unhappy, right? And yet they are the ones that helped allow this leadership to take place. And so again, people like this, I find them pitiable and sad, and yet they are also so incredibly dangerous. And in the book, they also talk about specifically how important it was to have the trainers at the Red Center be women. It was so important to have women indoctrinating other women. And so again, like, these women are given positions of power, like it seems like a position of power, when really they're just being manipulated and tricked and being given the scraps, making them think it's an important role when really they're just being manipulated. And also, even these women in power positions in Gilead, again, none of them are of any significance, right? Like, all of the actual leadership roles go to the men. And I'm pretty sure there is not a decision a single woman in Gilead can make that a man can't veto, or that a man has to approve, And like I said, there were aspects of seeing how Gilead came to be in the show that I found unnecessary. However, I did find Serena Joy's past very interesting, and she is another character that I'm curious what happens with her in the later seasons, because again, she was a fiery supporter, and she was hand in hand with her husband trying to get this government takeover. And in the book, she had been a singer, again, who was also an activist for this. But in the TV show, she wrote books about like the importance of traditional values, kind of a thing. And yet now she is living in a society where she and no other woman is even allowed to read. And we also see how, like, initially, again, she was part of this new regime taking over. And yet at one point she is getting ready to speak to a group, and her husband comes out and he's like, oh, like, I'm sorry, they don't want to hear from you. And she's just like, you know what? That's okay. We don't need to have contention amongst ourselves. So, that's fine. I don't need to speak today. And so, yeah, just seeing the baby steps to what led her to the life she is currently living, and how it is easier for her to act like this is what she wanted, because it's easier to be in denial than admit the fact that you're just like, wow, like, I helped this society happen when it is a society that I hate and that I am being oppressed too, right? So she would rather just be in denial and act like it's fine than realize the truth of the situation. And then also I wanted to talk about, like, this false respect this society has for motherhood. And we hear how a lot of the holidays have been removed, but they still celebrate Labor Day. However, now they interpret it as like being in labor, and that's what's being celebrated on Labor Day. And we also read, money was the only measure of worth for everyone. They got no respect as mothers. No wonder they were giving up the whole business. This way they're protected. They can fulfill their biological destinies in peace with full support and encouragement. And again, this is making a really important point as well because, like, yeah, mothers should be respected, right? But a society that thinks that all a woman is good for is to be a mother and have babies, obviously they don't actually respect women or mothers. Again, it's all about control and keeping women pigeonholed in this idea of what they need to be and getting them out of leadership positions. And also, in Gilead, do they really respect mothers? Because look how they treat mothers. June had a daughter who she was separated from, and now if she gives birth to a baby, she doesn't even get to raise that baby. She has to hand it off to someone else, and then she is expected to go and do the same thing all over again. And also, obviously, the fact that these women have no choice in whether or not they even want to become pregnant, right? It is forced upon them. And so they're claiming they respect mothers, but clearly they don't. And so again, this society, it is not about respecting women, respecting mothers. It's not about saving babies. It is always about control and power and getting women out of leadership positions. And this kind of reminds me, I was listening to a podcast where it was these two women who are part of this religious group that only has male leaders. And one lady she was sharing a story about how she was talking to one of these leaders, expressing her dissatisfaction with the fact that women aren't allowed to be in these important roles. And he told her, like, yeah, women are allowed to have these roles, but the mothers, they are the ones raising these boys who will go on to become the leaders. And so that is the impact that the women who are part of this church are making. They are raising these men. And how condescending and patronizing and raising men who later become leaders is not the same thing as actually getting women in leadership roles. And so again, that was a bit of a tangent, but kind of the same thing, right? Where it's like, oh, mothers, you're so important. And yet if that's all a woman is allowed to be, then that's misogynistic and horrible. But now to get into book versus movie versus TV show and just get into those a bit more. So I wanted to start out talking about the movie because I do feel like this is underrated and I really liked the movie and I would highly recommend it. And it isn't the story is bleak all the way around. And yet there is something about the TV show that just feels extra dark, I guess. And yet, having said that, watching the movie was also very emotional. And I thought everyone gave fantastic performances. And then I also liked the ending, like I said, because it's a positive ending, but they didn't ruin it by having some overly sappy ending. And so I would highly recommend the movie if you have not yet seen it. And then also, so the handmaids do not wear the wings, which I kind of missed because I feel like that is a really important part of their uniform, is the fact that like they have this tunnel vision and they're not allowed to look around, right? In the movie, they just wear the veils, and the red veils are talked about in the book. But yeah, in the 90s movie, that's all they have. They don't wear, like, they're called the wings, I think. So they don't have those here. But there are two things about the ceremony that I preferred in the 90s film. And so the ceremony begins, in all versions, it begins with the commander reading from the Bible about how, like, there's a part where, like, Rachel says, like, give me children or else I'll die. And in the book and in the TV show, the commander is just the one reading this. Whereas in the movie, the commander, he starts it, and then Serena Joy is part of this where she responds saying the part that Rachel has said. And so just incorporating her in this ritual in this way, something about that I just liked and it seemed fitting. And then also the fact that during the ceremony itself, both June and Serena Joy have veils on. And so having their faces covered with a veil during this religious act, I thought that was also just a detail that I liked a lot. I thought it was very fitting. And women wearing veils and having their faces covered during religious ceremonies, that is, something that has been going on for a long time, right? And it's something that we have carried over in a secular way because during a wedding, a woman has a veil. Even during funerals, sometimes it's not unheard of, even today, for a woman to wear a veil at a funeral. And so, yeah, these are things that came from like significant religious ceremonies and rituals, women's faces would be covered. And so, yeah, that was just a detail that I liked in the movie. And then also, I like how in the movie, we see at the start that they round up all people of color. We don't even know what happens to them. They just get them out. And I thought that was very accurate too, because chances are this leadership are not only misogynistic and homophobic, they're probably super racist too. So it makes sense that they want this idealized white society. And while with the TV show, I like that they do have a diverse cast. And also, well, in the TV show too, they make it seem like the lack of children, like the infertility that is happening in the world, they make it seem so much more dire and worse. And so I guess because it is a more extreme situation, it makes sense that they aren't picky about the color of a person's skin, because they're like, we just need to make some babies. It doesn't matter. Because yeah, in the show, the ambassador from Mexico shows up and she's a woman, and June tells her, because she is there to see the handmaids because they are interested in this, this program. And June tells her the truth of what is happening with the handmaids. And yet the ambassador is like, my city hasn't given birth in 6 years. So it's horrible what's happening to you. And yet, we got to do this anyway because my city is dying. We haven't given birth in 6 years. And so yeah, this aspect of the TV show, it just made the world seem even more bleak, because if this outsider, who is a woman, is saying she wants to be part of this she wants her country to be part of this handmaid program, it almost makes it feel like, is there any hope to end this then? If the whole world is having this infertility problem where no one is giving birth, that makes it seem like, well, who's going to try to stop this then, right? We see Canada, obviously people escape to Canada. And so clearly there are countries and leaderships that do want to put an end to it. And yet, yeah, having this whole infertility thing be so severe in the TV show, one, it makes sense why they aren't picky about the ethnicity of someone. But two, it also just felt too bleak, in my opinion, in some ways. But I did want to say, though, that episode when the ambassador comes to Gilead, I did love this whole episode, though. And I just thought, as she is questioning June and she questions the wives, I did think that was just a fantastic episode. And yet her willing to turn a blind eye just made it feel so hopeless. But I also feel like the show missed out, and again, I haven't seen the later seasons, maybe they do get into this, but I feel like they missed out on the opportunity to delve more into race and how this leadership views people of color. Because, for example, when I first started the show, in the very beginning, we see that June's husband, he was Black. And so initially I was like, oh wow, they're in a situation where both of them have so much at stake, right? Because in the book, her husband was a white man, so he was gonna be fine. And so I thought at the beginning that the show was going to delve in how her husband also had a lot to lose with this leadership, right? And yet they never do. And so I like that we have a diverse cast, but then I also feel like they missed out on an opportunity to really get into those themes as well. Because yeah, the book doesn't get into it at all. People of color are just taken out of this society and we don't hear about them. And so yeah, I just wish that the TV show had used this opportunity to delve more into this aspect of the world at this time. But yeah, the show I did like a lot, and there are just so many incredible scenes, some of which I've already talked about. But something else I wanted to say is the scene when June tells Nick that she is pregnant and they have this moment together, that was just an incredible scene, and it was so beautiful and touching while also being so horrible and sad. And so again, that was one of my favorite moments as well. And then the performances are obviously incredible, and then just the production, it's so well done. My biggest complaint really is just that it was 10 hours long, and I would have preferred this if they had just made it into a new movie. And so yeah, when it comes to the movie versus the TV show, honestly, people might be surprised, but this is a close call for me personally, because I did like the movie. And again, I'm also partial to movies. I prefer those over TV shows. And so it's a tough call. I almost don't know if I can choose between the two of them, because I would recommend both. But ultimately, when it comes to all three, the book still wins, because again, I think the book gives us just the right amount of information. And I love the ambiguity of the ending while still being a positive ending in a sense. And yeah, I love that the reader, again, can decide what we think has happened to June. And there is one final quote from the book that I want to share that came from the end of the book, and I didn't quite know where to put it in this video, but it is incredible, and so I'm just going to read it right now. "I'm sorry there is so much pain in this story. I'm sorry it's in fragments, like a body caught in a crossfire or pulled apart by force, but there's nothing I can do to change it. I've tried to put some of the good things in it as well. Flowers, for instance, because where would we be without them? Nevertheless, it hurts me to tell it over again. Once was enough. Wasn't once enough for me at the time, but I keep going with this sad and hungry and sordid, this limping and mutilated story because, after all, I want you to hear it, as I will hear yours if I ever get the chance." And so yeah, this book, again, I've shared so many quotes in this video, and while reading it, I was highlighting like crazy. And yeah, I just loved the writing of this book. And yeah, I just loved, and yeah, I just would highly recommend it, of course. But yeah, if you like the book, you should definitely check out the movie. And then if you're willing to spend 10 hours on the TV show, that is obviously worth watching as well. Elisabeth Moss is incredible in that. But yeah, anyway, I guess that wraps it up for The Handmaid's Tale. This has been a long one and kind of an intense one, but I'm glad I finally covered it. This has been on my radar to cover, like ever since I began Why the Book Wins. This has been on my radar. And yet, in November, I realized that January 20th would be the perfect day to release this video. And I don't want to be someone who is super bleak and has a very dark outlook on the future. I want to hope that things won't be as bad as some of us fear, right? And I'm hoping some of us are just over-exaggerating and it'll end up not being that bad, essentially. And yet there's also a part of me that has a very real fear going forward, right? But yeah, and also I know me being, even though I haven't gotten specific, me being this political, I know will upset people and maybe I'll lose subscribers, but honestly, I don't care. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.